Hello, hi everyone. Welcome. A big thank you for making time to join us today in our show and tell. We'll be sharing more details about digital inclusion research we commissioned as part of the Digital Inclusion Innovation Programme. We actually started crowdsourcing digital inclusion case studies right at the start of our programme because we knew that a lot had already been done to support digitally excluded Londoners. And we wanted to make sure that any project that we designed and worked on builds on this existing good practice rather than duplicating what's already been done. In a few minutes, I'll hand over to my colleague Will Bibby, who's done all the hard work on the research and actually put together a report, which we'll be sharing with you in a few weeks. But we'll spend the first 20 minutes or so sharing details and insights on the emerging themes in terms of existing digital inclusion provision, as well as share some of the challenges and opportunities identified by boroughs. We will then move on to sharing an initial set of recommendations, which the LOTI team, together with boroughs, will take forward and plan for how we incorporate them into our future work. But for now, please, a few can I just kind of reminders about the usual housekeeping rules. Can we move on to kind of that slide? Please, what I'd say is please stay on mute during the presentation. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions right at the end, but in the meantime, please do put your questions in the chat and we can either address them there and then, or we can return to them right at the end. I think for now, handing over to Will.
Thanks, Genta. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you today and looking forward to talking through some of the findings of the research that we've done and the upcoming report that will be published in a little bit. So I'm just going to quickly talk today about what we did, so what the purpose of the report was, what we did, and then I'm going to talk through briefly some of the headline findings. There's a lot more detail in the upcoming report, lots of case studies and examples, so do check that out when that's ready. So what we did was basically we did a review of how digital exclusion is being tackled across London. That was sort of the purpose, and we wanted to sort of address the lack of knowledge at a sort of a London-wide level of the initiatives underway, particularly in the context of COVID, when a lot of work, new work, has been happening to support digitally excluded Londoners. And we also wanted to take the opportunity to identify what some key common core challenges were for organisations, so councils and voluntary sector organisations, when they were supporting digitally excluded Londoners, and also looking for opportunities for London-wide action. So the findings and the insights in the report come from sort of 3 different sources. So LOTI did a big open sort of crowdsourcing questionnaire asking people working on digital inclusion to tell us what they were doing. And we got over 100 responses to that, which was really amazing. LOTI held 2 workshops with organisations working to tackle digital exclusion, focusing on things like challenges and opportunities. And then I also conducted 38 semi-structured in-depth interviews with people leading digital inclusion initiatives across the public, voluntary and private sectors. So I'm going to talk through some of the main approaches that organisations are taking, then talk through some key challenges, and I'm going to focus a lot on success factors today, and then briefly mention some of the recommendations that will be in the report. So there were sort of 6 broad high-level approaches that organisations took, and sometimes and very often they mixed and combined these approaches. And these were increasing digital skills and confidence, increasing access to devices, increasing access to the internet, providing dedicated one-to-one support, building digital inclusion capability, and the kind of the key role of libraries as a key kind of digital inclusion infrastructure. And in the report, we go through a lot of in these in a lot more detail and provide case studies and examples. In each one of these, people and organisations took slightly different approaches. So, for example, with digital skills, the use of digital champions was a really common approach. So training up volunteers or sometimes frontline staff to work on a one-to-one basis with digitally excluded people to build their skills. Other approaches included things like informal sort of drop-in skills sessions in libraries or other community buildings. Also including things like formal IT courses as well. So quite a range of different approaches around improving digital skills and confidence. Increasing devices, a similar range. So whether that was device lending or device gifting, whether schemes chose to purchase new devices or refurbished devices, and then also what kind of device would be used as well, whether it's a tablet or a laptop or a Chromebook. Increasing access to the internet, a really tricky issue that I'll go into in a little bit more detail as well. But approaches range from providing dongles to securing free or subsidized broadband packages for low-income residents to providing community Wi-Fi in community buildings. This was less common, but also quite interesting. So some councils provided dedicated one-to-one support services. So some councils offered a helpline where any resident could ring up with a specific task or issue and get talk through that problem. And there were also some dedicated sort of digital support services. For example, Tower Hamlets have an appointment-based service where someone can make an appointment and get face-to-face support with a particular challenge, often to do with something like filling in an application for some kind of public service. Building digital inclusion capability. This was a common approach taken by some of the big national digital inclusion charities, where they would support lots of smaller organisations that are really embedded within communities and working with digitally excluded people to build the capacity within those organisations to provide digital inclusion support. And then libraries, it came up over and over again, such a core institution, a core bit of infrastructure in terms of digital inclusion, a place where people go to learn, a place where people could access the internet, a place where they could get devices. Often device lending schemes or gifting schemes were done through distributed through libraries, and also libraries were a place where a lot of these things were brought together as well. So, as I say, lots more detail will be in a report with lots of interesting case studies and examples as well. So I'm going to move on to some of the key challenges. These ones I'm talking about here will be the ones that kind of came up the most commonly when speaking to the people working on digital inclusion, and the biggest one by far was the challenge around connectivity and in particular securing access to affordable broadband for residents. And during conversations, it was very clear that the issue in the context of digital exclusion is not infrastructure. It's not a lack of infrastructure. It's really affordability. And lots of councils, like I said, taking really interesting approaches to this, but many councils found this like incredibly difficult and felt like they didn't have the powers or the resources to adequately tackle this on their own. So that does point us to a big need to work with internet providers and definitely think about what we do at a London-wide level. Another really big challenge was reaching digitally excluded residents. Often the way that we reach residents and communicate with residents is through digital means, and obviously that won't work in this context. And a few things that made it particularly difficult. Obviously, the pandemic made things quite challenging as well, also another thing that was commonly mentioned was that digitally excluded residents are often likely to be socially excluded residents as well. It's often very difficult for public services to adequately reach socially excluded residents as well. So a big challenge, but there are definitely things that organisations and councils have been doing to successfully reach digitally excluded residents, which I'll get onto in a little bit. The third big challenge was, particularly in the context of devices, is really meeting the scale of the need. There was a huge need before COVID, and there'll be a big need sort of post COVID in the recovery, but that need has really kind of been exacerbated and highlighted. It's a little bit hard to say for sure what the scale of the need is across London, but a couple of boroughs did some analysis locally, and for example, Tower Hamlets kind of estimates that there's a need of around 10,000 devices. Newham similarly around 5,000, and it's just proven really hard to really ramp up what we can get to people. So that's a big challenge, and again, perhaps points to the need for some London-wide action as well. The last three key challenges. So this might feel quite obvious and almost not need to be said, but lack of funding and capacity for digital inclusion is a big challenge. A lot of the time, digital inclusion will be tacked on to someone's day job, quite understandably. I used to work in a council for 4 years and absolutely know what the context is like, and it's got worse since I've left, right? So funding is a huge challenge, but it's particularly a challenge in this context because a lot of the digital inclusion work has been funded through external funding that is tied to or related to support around COVID. And so the risk here is as a sort of a sustainability one. When that COVID-related funding goes, how will the digital inclusion work, the amazing work that's kind of been initiated, how will that keep going? 5 is, and I mentioned before, it's kind of hard to get a bit of a really good sense of the scale of need and where that is. And this is a really common challenge that a lot of councils mentioned. And LOTI are doing some great work to basically build a digital exclusion map, a London-wide digital exclusion map. So hopefully this will address some of those challenges, and would recommend anyone getting in touch about that as well. And the final big challenge here is sort of around the lack of evidence on digital inclusion programs. It's not to say that they don't work. It's just it's like I mentioned before, there's loads of different approaches, and it's really hard to know which ones are the most effective, what works. There's a few evaluations out there, but not many. And it's also can be quite challenging to do some of this stuff. So that's a big challenge as well. I'm going to talk about some success factors now that have been identified by a range of different organisations, often to get around and overcome some of these challenges. So the first one, this is a really key one, work with the VCS. So huge one, and this is a really effective way at reaching digitally excluded residents. So working with organisations that work with people, Londoners who are likely to be digitally excluded, is a huge one, and this is one of the successes of a lot of the national digital inclusion charities. They work through communities and community organisations to reach digitally excluded residents very successfully. Establish partnerships. So A lot of great examples of cross-sector partnerships, being able to leverage in much more resources and support that councils were able to do on their own, whether that's like just straight up financial resources to support digital inclusion stuff, or whether it's getting like 300 devices in by working with a partner, or it's being able to reach more people and different types of communities than you would have been able to on your own. Using social value, so specifically using social value from contracts with internet providers, potentially as well as other organizations as well, but the big one here is sort of using the social value from internet providers can really secure significant benefits. Lots of examples of councils getting sort of free community Wi-Fi across a lot of their buildings, securing free or subsidized broadband packages for low-income families, running digital champion programs, things like that. So can definitely be well worth it. But the learning here is that councils really need to be proactive and clear about what you want, and sort of go to them with a clear list of offers. And yeah, explore innovative funding models. So things like crowdfunding. There's a few really great examples of crowdfunding and other types of sort of campaign models where over hundreds of thousands of pounds have been brought in and then sort of match funded by the council for things like devices, and it's also really a really effective way at shining a light on these types of issues as well, and bringing citizens and other organisations around this particular issue as well. Another key success factor is building digital inclusion inclusion into council strategies, and having sort of it backed by senior leadership. A lot of the most successful programs now have been running for a little while, and so and are starting to be baked in at a sort of council-wide strategy level, and that's just kind of sort of significant in the context that a lot of work has started since COVID, and may have been led by a specific service or what have you. So it's really important to think about how you can build on that and start building that into council strategies going forward. Having a dedicated digital inclusion role, it's very difficult, can be very difficult to resource, but has a big impact. It has a big impact, particularly in things like digital champion programs. It can make a really big difference to how many people you can get through there, how many people you can support. So yeah. In terms of digital skills, it's really important to pitch that at the right level, and it's really important to sort of start with the basics, start where people are at, focusing on the basics, providing that in a really informal setting, make sure it's nice and relaxed and accessible, and delivered in either one-to-one settings or in small groups. These are the things that kind of came up over and over again that were found to be particularly important when supporting people with digital skills. Another kind of really important related success factor is with device gifting or lending schemes, it has to be coupled with skill support. Otherwise, there's a big risk that devices won't be used. We heard a number of examples where devices were given and either returned or were still in the box unopened, sort of 3 months later, just because people didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to turn them on. They didn't know how to use them. They didn't know what they could be used for. So really important when thinking about a device gifting scheme is what that skill support looks like. And related, it's important to provide a range of devices, from PCs to Chromebooks to laptop to tablets, because different residents have a variety of needs, which some devices are better to meet than others. So, for example, it seems like older residents prefer tablets than something like a laptop. So it's just important to think about who you're trying to support, and if you're trying to support lots of people, thinking about having a range of different devices. Scale support through existing infrastructure. So yeah, it should be digital inclusion. You should think about what's already available and how you can scale and embed this work through community infrastructure such as libraries. That's a really big one, but also things like community halls, children's centres, tenants and residence halls, these kind of things. Really key one here, and lots of councils are doing this really well. Related to this is building on the key role of libraries. A really core bit of the infrastructure here, and libraries have been really key in reaching and supporting those in need. Despite closures during lockdowns, a lot of libraries changed what they did. Some came up with helplines. Some had digital champions going out into the community. So yeah, build on the key role of libraries is a key one here. And then finally, this is the sort of the last key success factor, is think about how to upskill staff to support digitally excluded residents. So particularly library staff, lots of great examples here, but also other frontline staff who work with people who are likely to be digitally excluded, upskilling those staff members to be able to have the skills and confidence to then support someone who's digitally excluded is really important. So in the last minute, I am just going to quickly talk through the 6 recommendations for London-wide action that will be in the report. And again, like with all of these things, there's lots more detail in the report that will be coming up. So do check that out. The first recommendation is to launch a London-wide scheme to provide refurbished devices to all digitally excluded Londoners. The second recommendation is around using the collective power of councils to secure more affordable broadband deals for residents. So that could take many different forms, and we go into that in more detail in the report. But this is really about tackling that really big challenge and working together to do that. Recommendation 3 is about building the digital inclusion capacity within London's community infrastructure. So particularly focusing on libraries as well as local community groups that work with digitally excluded Londoners. We've got to work with the local VCS if we really want to reach people. So key there is how we do that and how we build the capacity. Recommendation 4 is about facilitating the sharing of knowledge and best practice in digital inclusion. There's so much amazing work going on across London, and we try and shine a light on it in the report. But there's so much going on, so it's about how we are able to best share and facilitate the sharing of that knowledge. Recommendation 5 is about I mentioned before, LOTI are working on this really incredible digital exclusion map, and how about we promote and build on that together and input into that to identify local needs as well as what available support is there as well. And recommendation 6 is around how we build the evidence base for digital inclusion and get a better understanding of what works. And again, there'll be sort of specific sort of sub recommendations under each to give a bit more meat on the bones. So I am going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening. We'll share this after the meeting, so you can kind of go into it at your own leisure as well. And I'll hand back over to Genta. I think we're going to take some questions now, are we?
We are. But I just want to say thank you very much to you, Will, doing this research for us. And I just want to say thank you very much to borrowers as well. This research would not have been made possible actually without their help and support and their contributions to our crowdsourcing exercise. So thank you.
Absolutely. And all the amazing voluntary community organisations I spoke to, a couple of housing associations and some social enterprises and businesses too.
Absolutely. I think we've got one question in the chat, and I think, Will, you touched on this earlier, but Alex is asking, is there any insight or data on device use once donated?
I don't have robust data on that. I do have some insights, anecdotal they are. This goes back to the point around really needing to couple device gifting with skills support. There have been a few like small scale examples where like these were pilots. So I think sort of in the order of like 10 devices in a pilot, and sort of this one I'm particularly thinking of. I think around half of the devices weren't used. This was when the devices was just sort of given and no support was there. So in the later iterations of that was made sure that everyone who received a device received support, and then the usage went up a lot. So you know, I don't want to extrapolate from like, you know, it's 50% or anything. Like, let's not do that. But the point is, they are tend to be used when support is provided, and there's a risk of them not being used when support is not provided.
Thank you for that. That's, you know, something really, really useful and helpful for us to kind of bear in mind as we move forward. We've got, sorry, I'm just trying to digest Rachel's comments. So yeah, absolutely agreeing with what we've been saying. Any questions from anyone else? I think my colleague Sam had.
Shall I stop sharing my screen so we can see people if they put their hand up?
That would be great. Thank you. Any other questions at all from anyone about any of this? I mean, we'll be sharing the actual report in the next couple of weeks through our usual channels. So again, you'll have more kind of opportunity to kind of get involved and ask questions, comment on that as well. We've got a question from Rachel asking, are there any insights from advice providers like citizens advice bureaus and similar organizations?
Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to speak to any citizens advice bureaus. No, so unfortunately, no. Yeah, that was a shame.
But we have a lot kind of from other voluntary, as you mentioned, Will, from other voluntary and community organizations and some private sector organizations as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did speak to a lot of about 10 different VCS organizations, not all sort of advice providers, but many who are working in that space and many who are specifically working on digital inclusion. I think, I mean, lots of insights. I think the big one I think would be those organizations have existing relationships with people that they're working with, people in the communities they're working with, and often there's overlap between those people and people. Those people tend to also be digitally excluded, so they have relationships with people who are digitally excluded, and it's about how we work with those organizations and support those organizations to support people with who are digitally excluded. So working through those organizations and with those organizations to support digitally excluded residents. I think that's probably the biggest and most important insight with regards to those organizations. I think it's a really key one, in fact.
Great. Well,
thanks. Sorry, I should have. My system's really slow, so I couldn't turn on my camera and my microphone, but it has now switched on. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Was quite. You were talking into the void there.
No worries. Hi, Rachel.
we've got another question, Will, from Cosimo, asking, is there any evidence charities who are already supporting service users on other aspects are more able to reach those they work with rather than external organizations?
Is there any evidence charities who are already supporting? So I would say there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this. Yes, this is a theme that came up during my interviews quite a lot. I would also say in my former role at Nesta, where I worked for 3 years, I worked in our social action and people power team, and we came across a lot of examples and evidence of community organizations, charities, not every charity, you know, charities are very, very broad, but like community organizations definitely being able to, and community-based models being able to reach residents and people that public services typically struggle to. So, yeah, I'd be fairly confident in saying that that's the case. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. I think very final call for any last questions, and then we'll conclude with run slightly over time as well. Okay, great. In that case, what I will say is, if you'd like to kind of hear more about the program, or keep up to date with progress, please visit our project page on our website, the link of which I've shared in the chat. And just to say thank you very much to Will, thank you very much to you for joining us, and thank you very much to Boris for helping and contributing to this really, really important work. So thank you. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.